Hello, welcome everyone to the Right Around the Murray Festival. I'd like first to acknowledge the Wiradjuri people as the traditional custodians of this land and pay respect to Wiradjuri elders past and present, and extend that respect to all First Nations people, and particularly any here tonight and all of you here tonight. My name's Anne-Marie. I'm the festival director, and it gives me great pleasure to present tonight's program, this evening's program. Tonight's event features Debra Dank in conversation about her incredible tribute to Gidangji country and people. We come with this place. Debra will be speaking with local Koori academic Michelle Evans. Michelle is a Fulbright scholar whose extensive grounding in community, the arts, education and leadership has led her into the areas of economics and business management, including the role of Associate Dean Indigenous at the Melbourne Business School, where she established Australia's #1 Indigenous Business Masterclass program and the now 2-year-old Dylan Dua Centre for Indigenous Business Leadership. Michelle is also the founder of the Willan Centre for Indigenous Arts and Cultural Development at the Victorian College of the Arts and founder of Charles Sturt University's Indigenous Entrepreneurship Pop-Up Innovation Hub. So Michelle is the host of this conversation with Debra, and when Michelle and Debra take the stage in about 15 minutes, Michelle will introduce Debra. But first, this evening we have local Gomeroi writer Racheal Oak Butler, who I am thrilled to have beginning our evening tonight. Racheal is an accomplished musician with a lifelong performing career and is currently working on both a stage play and a manuscript based on the story shared in this original and deeply personal monologue that we're about to hear, called My Calling. So please settle in and enjoy the evening. Here is Racheal Oak Butler with My Calling.
Mary! Nana Mary! Silence. Nothing. I wanted some kind of sign, but the place was quiet and still. Nana Mary! My words reverberated off the rocks and back at me, standing there worried and completely overwhelmed. I was worried about taking too long for Pop, who was too unwell to leave the car, and overwhelmed by everything. Being on this trip, being in this place, some kind of ravine at the end of a bitumen-coated footpath built for tourists to come and gawk at. A sacred place where my ancestors had once gathered. My ancestors. Nana Mary! Auntie Elsie! Tears were streaming down my face. I'd spent most of my adult life hiding from my grandparents and disconnected from nearly everyone I was related to. It had always been much easier to say I didn't really have a family. I'd been on my own for so long. In the last 2 years, my stepmum, biological mum, and kind of adopted dad had died, solidifying this further. And my brothers and I had long been in pieces. And just weeks after finding out my grandmother had died, here I was, finally reconnecting with my grandfather. Lost in a sea of questions, uncomfortable and awkward in my long-sleeve shirt, attempting a disguise of well-dressed, respectable and normal, and desperate to learn as much as I could from a man who had spent a lifetime hiding a secret. after all this time we had wasted and all that we had lost. Miri! Miri is a Gomeroi word meaning star. It was the only word I knew of my great-grandmother's language, which we lost when she was stolen. All I could do was to call out to her, speak her language, our language. Gamilaroi. I am Gomeroi. My grandfather's mum was stolen at 2 years old, enslaved, beaten, raped, and then married off at 14. She lost her family, her culture, her people, and just like her firstborn child was stolen. Pop and I were driven up from my place to his, 1,000 k's away and worlds apart. He told me his secret a few days before we left, whilst I was washing the dishes. I'll never forget those words. "You know we've got Aboriginal in us and your father has an attitude problem," he blurted out, attempting a casual tone as if mentioning the weather. But the weather was a storm our family didn't speak of, and his tone was gripped in 86 years of burden and holding face. I knew him to be the whitest white man I'd ever met. He worked so hard at his whiteness, making him rigid and intolerant of all things. He could be set off at the drop of a hat and off he'd go, declaring his disdain. You see, there were rules and ways of being, and anyone that wasn't white, Australian, hetero and male would instantly break them. I was fearful of showing up as an adult. Tattooed, pierced, gender bent, hairy armpitted. Just one look at me and anyone would scream, poofter. Reconnecting with him though, I noticed he'd softened a little. I saw things I hadn't let myself remember because it would have made our distance so much harder. He had a love and wonder for animals, and he loved this land. He'd seen more of this country than anyone else I know. He could make and fix anything, rebuild any motor from the ground up. And he had such a quick wit and humour and the ability to tell great stories with finely tuned detail. Pop's revelation, it shook me to my core. I found myself realising the enormity of his secret in new ways each time it hit me, and just how much my great-grandmother's traumas had formed all of us. I was so confused and angry at him though, but I had to hide it because I was also shattered for him by what had made him keep the secret. Fear. It had hardened and shaped him into a man so scared of the repercussions his Aboriginality would have on his life and his family. He was the product of assimilation and education of white society. We've all had our ears filled with the whitewashed propaganda world of Captain Cook, Terra Nullius and the great explorers conquering this wide brown land and blah, blah, blah. When actually, there were wars, thieving of lands, massacres, terrorising and maiming people and their cultures and criminalising them. Stealing children, slavery, segregation, genocidal government policies to assimilate and breed out the black, entrenching beliefs, systems and structures, and the continuance of racist policies, some are still held today. It's impacted so many people for too long, and yet so much of it still goes unspoken. The great Australian whitewash. It's created many ears that can't hear anything else. In some ways, telling people about my Aboriginality had similarities to coming out, in that the very personal can somehow become politicised, objectified, and the subject of other people's opinions. I've always been well versed at saying, I'm not just queer, but odd, wielding a wry smile. Trying to ease someone's awkward realisation as they find out that I'm gay. Try and make light of the coming outness that can happen any time when meeting someone new. In all my travels, I've come across and confronted all the overt and covert isms in too many ways to count. I knew how to shake that shit off. Little dog syndrome I had. Or little dyke syndrome, as I like to call it. But now, I didn't know how to say anything. It was too much. My grandfather's words had changed what I knew to be my foundations, and yet, at the same time, made certain things in my life that much clearer. I reached out, trying to tell people. Some who knew me well instantly said how much it made sense and wanted to celebrate. But there was also a lot of, how much of a part are you? If it's your great-grandmother, how Aboriginal can you be after 100-odd years or more? What percentage are you? One person decided I was 1/16th. I was so defensive. I knew my great-grandmother until I was 10. And if they weren't trying to quantify my Aboriginality, it was awkward moments of people trying to give me their opinion about Aboriginal people or tell me about their Aboriginal friend who had nothing to do with anything. Or a lot of, you can get free stuff now. And those jobs you can't get when you're white. It all left me dumbfounded and exacerbating my despair. What I should have said was, comes with bundles of free stuff. Ignorance, racism. There was a disconnect and inability to hear or fathom what I was saying. And if there was any understanding, I think it confronted a lot of people with their own ignorance and shame. I too had a lot to learn. 24 hours before heading off with Pop, I walked into an Aboriginal organisation. So fearful people wouldn't believe me, and ashamed of my need to ask Aboriginal people for help, all whilst coming from a racist family. I was ashamed of being fair-skinned, ashamed of the privileges that can afford you, and I was awkward and kept apologising for myself. I kept saying, but I'm white though. To which one of the women said, well, I say we've got all kinds of coffee in my family. Latte, macchiato, long black, short black with a touch of milk. You see, the old people, the ancestors, they've been calling me home my whole life. I've seen their spirits. I've dreamt about them too. I've experienced things that there are no words in English to describe except to say they've been calling me. Years ago, I dreamt about an old man who came up to me and hugged me with his whole body embracing mine. He began to sing the sound of a yidaki. The sound came up from the earth and into both of us, settling my spirit. In another, a woman in her 50s grabbed me by the arms, held me firmly, saying, "You have to come and find me, Racheal. You have to come and find us. My name is Auntie Elsie." And then I woke up, desperate to go back into that dream, knowing she was about to tell me her last name, but I couldn't sleep. I was wide awake with Auntie Elsie's image and intense call in my mind. I yearned to see the old people, like I have since I was a kid. I wanted a sign, but those big old rocks, they just stood there witnessing my tears. Leaving the ravine behind me and walking back to Pop's car, I thought of Auntie Elsie and the urgency of her call again and the desperate need for 4 generations to go home. The radio was playing when I got back. That's the way it's gonna be, little... He turned it off in such a huff. You can't understand the words of any of this so-called music they blast on the wireless these days. It's all just noise and too much harping on. And that bloody Daryl, whatever his name is, I mean, what's a horse's yeah anyway? My pop's passed on now, but I hold dear in my heart his courage, for after a lifetime of fear, he managed to pass on this knowledge to me. And I think in his way, try to start to undo the wrongs that have been done. Throughout this journey, I've been supported, taught and welcomed by community in the most humbling of ways. I'll never be able to thank them all enough. I've gained even more of an insight into just how strong, resilient, courageous, tolerant, patient and generous Aboriginal people are and have been against all odds. Aboriginal people, my people, are warriors in the truest sense of the word, and I aspire to be the same. To my Nana Miri, you were one of at least 100,000 children stolen. I honour you, and I stand with you. I want to try to learn and give back as much as I can. And in doing so, I hope this helps you find your way home.
Thanks, Racheal, for sharing my calling. First Nations storytellers and writers bravely share with all of us the embodied experiences and responses they have to the continued colonial project. So I want to say thank you to all of our First Nations authors here tonight and throughout this festival and all writers' festivals here for fearlessly sharing your truth. It's also important to note for the audience that there has been and will likely be some discussion of violence, so please take care of yourself tonight and contact services like Lifeline or 13 Yarn or Beyond Blue if you need to connect with someone, just as a warning. My name is Michelle Evans. Thank you, Anne-Marie, for the introduction. I'm a Koori woman from the Hunter Valley and I live here with my wife and boys in Albury. We've been here for about 7 years and it's a wonderful place to be. So let me say it is a great honour as a visitor who has come to stay here on Wiradjuri country to acknowledge Wiradjuri country, to acknowledge the expanse of it, the 3 rivers, the woodlands, the grasslands, the rocky outcrops and the big sky country. We acknowledge Wiradjuri people and most importantly of all, we acknowledge Wiradjuri elders past and present. Wiradjuri country here in Bungambalwatha, or what is now known as Albury, rests on the banks of the mighty Millawabilla, or the Murray River. This gathering place, this crossing place, this mixed mob place is the homelands of the Wiradjuri people, always was, always will be. This evening we're here to meet and listen and dialogue with Debra Dank, a Gidangji woman married to Rick and her 3 adult children, 2 grandchildren. Debra is an educator and she's worked in teaching and learning for many, many years, a gift given through hard work of her parents. Debra continues to experience the privilege of living with country and with family. Debra recently completed her PhD in narrative theory and semiotics at Deakin University in 2021, and I know that her supervisor is in the audience, which is a wonderful pleasure. Debra is the author of We Come With This Place, shortlisted for the 2023 Stella Prize, finalist for the Queensland Premiers Awards for a work of state significance, winner of the Queensland Literary Award for Non-Fiction, winner of 4 New South Wales Premier Literary Awards, including the Douglas Stewart Prize for Non-Fiction, the UTS Glenda Adams Award for New Writing, the Indigenous Writers Prize, and Book of the Year. But perhaps the most prized by Debra is winner of the Australian Literature Society Gold Medal in 2023. Congratulations and welcome, Debra, to our place here on the border. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you, Michelle. That sounds a little bit intimidating, but these things happen. I too want to add my acknowledgement to a country that I have always just seen this big sky thing on a map. So I thank sincerely the Wiradjuri country and its communities for their hospitality, and big greetings to Racheal and the Gamilaroi mob, and thank you. And yes, this was part of my PhD, and I was very happy and quite excited. I was very excited with the idea of writing 90,000 words of theory, and then this amazingly wise supervisor, Associate Professor Antonia Pont, said, "Have you thought about including some stories to illustrate?" So things happen.
Well, let's talk about the stories and the wisdom that you share through We Come With This Place. They're stories that you've been listening to and for. They're stories from your family and your country that you've been hearing and listening across your whole life, Debra. And yet I can only imagine how incredible and overwhelming all the accolades must be. I have often heard this phrase that is attributed to Dr. Maya Angelou, where she says, "I don't pick that up, I don't lay that down." The idea that if we pick up all the compliments, then we've also got to pick up all the reproaches. I mean, my question, Debra, is how are you living with the responses to the work?
I'm still kind of a little bemused, but really grateful for the level of engagement I think that people are having with this book, because it's almost not quite accidental, but it's almost this casual kind of contribution from me. The big thing around this book is that it reflects Gidangji and Wakaya mob. It reflects the country. And it's about people and place. It's not so much about me writing the words on the page. So I don't have a sense of picking things up and putting them down, because this story is so much bigger than me, and it's a small part of the lives, the very ordinary and the amazingly extraordinary lives that people live every single day. So I'm amazingly appreciative of the opportunities that it is giving me, But yeah, I like Dr. Angelou's words. I think they're incredibly wise.
I think we're going to have a conversation about that beyond tonight. I mean, you have said before that you didn't write the book alone, that you listened it into being. Can you describe your listening of those stories and how you transpose them through your remembering onto the page and this process of writing?
Yeah, I think, one of the privileges that was mine growing up is I had these amazing parents. I was incredibly wise in my selection of parents. So my mum, both of my parents are Aboriginal. Both of them are now in other places, but they're, don't be mean to me because my mum and dad are here. But I had my mum, who was 15 just before I was born. She read and she read and she read. She spoke English really well. My mum was a telephonist. And then I had my dad who he sang Slim Dusty songs to learn to speak English. Go Slim Dusty. So he didn't read or write English, but he had the most amazing capacity. And as I listened to Racheal's story, my dad, he could fix anything, he could make anything, but he knew how to live on country. So I had these two really interesting almost contrasts. And so it was always about listening, because Good Angie and Wakai are mob. We come from Big Plains country. My country is in the Northern Territory on the Barkly Tablelands. And if anyone's been to the Barkly Tablelands, I taught my kids to drive there when they were about 5 years old because it's just open plains country. 95 kilometres across a 100-kilometre plain, there's a tree on the left-hand side. It's been home to the most beautiful wedge-tailed eagle family for a very long time. So you have to listen in those sorts of places. And you listen not just with your ears. I think, we're taught that these are the things that we listen with. And we're not being told the full story because we listen with so much more than just our ears. So, yeah, it was always just listening. And if you listen well enough on country, it will tell you stories because there are stories happening constantly. And, of course, where I come from, as soon as the sun starts going down, then people need to be quiet. And that's when the big stories are heard. When you lie listening and looking at the stars, those stories start to come and they sort of creep into your ear if you listen properly. So incredibly, amazingly beautiful. It was so harsh. It was really harsh, my childhood. But it was a gift.
And stories beyond just those that you heard from people.
Yep. Yeah. Our lives we live storied lives. Our lives are creating stories constantly. I think that in the process of remembering those stories, we have the ability to make choices around how we engage with those stories and how we see them, what learning we find in those. So, my parents were, because we were dirt poor and, we lived in a car body in the back of the cemetery for a little while, not too long, but just a little while. But, one of the jobs that my dad did so that they could move into town for me to go to high school, they were saving up money, he collected the pans from the outhouse down the back. My dad was as tough as old boots, but he couldn't wash the pans. So my mum and I washed the pans. So as a 6-year-old, I scrubbed those pans so that people could have a not so obscenely stinky toileting experience. So that was when we lived in town, but then we went bush, and the most amazing, amazing place. As long as we kept away and kept wise to all of those external threats, and they were always around.
The Indigenous Writers' Prize judges in the New South Wales Premier Awards were Amber and Quai Mulliner, Michaela Saunders and Luke Patterson. And I know, Debra, you said to me earlier that you didn't read their responses to your work. I very much encourage you to. I'm going to read just a little bit for everyone to listen to. They said when they picked you as the winner this year that Dank effortlessly takes us from creation times when travelling water women made her country to images of her grandchildren visiting sacred trees where Gandhi had lived for millennia, the in-between times, the coming of the cattle, the terror when the new sound of metal on rock was first heard by her family, are all told too in a quintessentially Aboriginal fashion. This is only a small piece. Please read this. The judges really speak about the depth of stories that you write from creation times through to recent times. Debra, you can weave and reveal Indigenous understandings of deep time, that past, present and future are all happening in this eternal now. They are connected and connecting to us right here, right now. Your book, Debra, is a masterclass in showing Indigenous ways of knowing and being. Did this weaving through times unfold naturally in the writing process?
I think that's why I'm still a little bit bemused by the response, because this is us.
Right.
This is us. Antonia said, "How are we going with the story?" And I thought, oh, far out, I better write. I better do some. And so it was literally right. And so I suppose I really wanted to engage truthfully and authentically, ethically, we're talking about ethics today, with the process around engaging in a practice-led research study. So I was very conscious of not imagining how to construct narrative. I was very conscious of doing the thing authentically, representing my family, representing my place authentically. So I sat and wrote, and then I said to Antonia, I don't think chapters are going to work. And Antonia said, well, don't use chapters. And I thought, oh, there's an idea. And so we talked about that process, and I've come up with these episodes, and I probably shouldn't tell you this because she's sitting right here. It came to time for me to send off the work to Antonia, and I thought, so I literally scrolled down and thought, that's a break. Return. I really needed to engage in the way that was truly representative. So this non-linear journeying, my aunt, she's no longer with us either, but she would ring and we'd have a yarn, and then 3 weeks later I'd run into her, I'd go visit her at her house. And she'd say, oh yeah, and you know what, and I was thinking about, so the conversation would literally continue. So we've always got these threads just, weaving through and around, and it all ties together and makes sense throughout the process. But this is us.
This is us.
I think the other thing is that as Aboriginal people, we use English language vocabulary in a very different way. And I think if you have read other Aboriginal writers' work, you could probably tell that you are reading something produced by an Aboriginal writer, because there's a different kind of rhythm and a different kind of musicality within the narrative, and the way that that narrative is formed and the way that it grows is really quite different and distinct. And I have another book coming out to explain some of that. So, yeah.
Yeah. We look forward to that, the more academic part of the journey. I mean, these are some of the stories of Gadanga country and Wakea country. You've described them as a collection of ordinary stories about events and about creation, stories about clouds, stories of your dad and your mum. They walk across the country and they speak to the longevity of your family's connection to country. But they also include sad, violent, disturbing stories where you tell the truth about massacres, about violence, about the rape of your grandmother, about losing 10 story men at once, about living hand to mouth, about lived reality of government policies on Aboriginal lives, including the protection era, about being alien under the Act, about exemption certificates, about legally not being able to own assets. I mean, let's talk about trust and distrust between Aboriginal people and the government, Debra.
Is that a thing?
Let me narrow this down, perhaps. How does First Nations literature contribute to the rebuilding of trust for Aboriginal people, for you?
I think I've always been a reader. I honestly can't remember not reading. Again, my mum, and the expectation of my dad. My dad demanded that I engage in this world. And it's always just been, I read, and I've not, until very recently, I'm 60, I haven't found us. I look around here and I see a lot of photographs and I see names and I see people identified. I don't have any of that. I have photographs of groups of Aboriginal people, and there's nobody named. But in the book that I'm imagining now, the man who raped my grandmother and at least 3 of the others who raped her alongside of him, they are named and they are celebrated in that book. And I know that my grandmother's mother is in one of those photographs, but I don't know who she is.
No.
Because my mob were not named. And it doesn't matter where I go and what I read around the cattle industry, for example, in the Northern Territory, there is so little recognition of exactly who did the work. My mob did the work. And I am part of the Stolen Wages group in Queensland. My parents are part of the Stolen Wages group in Queensland. My dad, my grandmother, my great-grandparents, they are all part of the Stolen Wages group in the Northern Territory. We did the work. We don't ever get the recognition from non-Aboriginal community. And that really got up my nose. And I thought, no, it's time, because I still go home and I still sit next to the non-Aboriginal folk who are taking up pastoral leases on my country, who sit beside me and my elders and talk about their place.
Yeah.
And I think you cannot continue with this level of ignorance. It's time. It's time. So the government facilitates this, but I'm a great believer in the idea that we actually are responsible for the government. We get the government that we allow to happen. I don't subscribe to the idea that the government is accountable, because the government is only able to do what it does with our permissioning or with our non-participation, our allowance of non-accountability. So I think, we all need to be a lot more personally, accountable and responsible. So, the trust in the government. In the book, I talked about a couple on Oban Station, the Corbetts, and that was the first time I'd become very conscious of the ability of non-Aboriginal people to be decent. Mrs. Corbett bought me my first dress. It was pink and frilly. Do I look like a pink and frilly girl? Pink and frilly. She never once complained about my sister pouring accidentally her red nail polish all over her beautiful white chenille bedspread. She didn't complain about the mess we made in the station kitchen when she took us in to make cakes. She didn't complain about doing the cleaning of the station because she knew that my mother was a better teacher. They refused to go to places where Aboriginal people were barred. They made personal choices. So the decency of people, that's the thing that I trust in.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. I really felt those tensions between belonging and not belonging when you talked about the differences you felt between your dad and his family and your mum and her family. You wrote, with my dad I had a history, on page 47. But with your mum's family, you wrote, it was hard for me to find myself there, on page 46. This knowing and not knowing and our identification of our cultural identity, it's such a central part of who we are. I mean, how did you nurture that strong sense of belonging across these tensions over time, Debra?
My mum's family loved me. They did. It wasn't always obvious, but my mum's family lived in a really awkward and really difficult situation. I was born in the 60s, and my recollection is that, living in Camberwell was a great community, and that it was a community, as long as everybody remembered their place.
Yeah.
And so my mum's family are quite fair-skinned, and so there was that. It was not necessarily negotiated, but there was a level of freedom as long as they remembered their place.
Yes.
They were not welcome in the CWA hall, other than my mum and other young Aboriginal girls invited in to sing. But things like that, and in the town hall, whenever there was a dance, when I was very young, Aboriginal people weren't allowed in, and I remember looking through the louvers of the town hall. And of course the irony is that my mum's family, the Scottish Methodists, were a big part of establishing non-Aboriginal community across the Barkly Tablelands.
Right.
And then being barred. And, you know, my mum's grandfather, he was quite rich, and he left some money to his family. But because they were half castes, they were not allowed to inherit much. So he was able to leave some money for my grandmother, my great-grandmother, to be educated at a very nice school. But they couldn't own his properties, and the white housekeeper got those things because she was the closest relative.
Wow.
So there was this strange kind of context, you know. People knew that my mum's family did come from a moneyed background, but they were now dirt poor because of their indigeneity. But it was not ever spoken about.
And I think over the many years and years and years that indigeneity and poverty have been welled together as a strong, connected part of the social contract, really.
Oh, absolutely. And you see, I didn't have any of that complexity around trying to figure out who was who in the zoo with my dad.
No.
With my dad, it was just, yep. And one day when, you know, so much seemed to have happened when I was about 7 or 8, I said to Dad one day, why is he doing that? Why does he treat us like that? And he says, oh, it's because we're black, bub. Just get on with it and get over it. And that was it. That
was it.
You know, because it was very clear. Again, you know, this idea of almost this sense of where our place was.
Yes.
So, yeah, it's all terribly nuanced and hierarchical and, skin-based.
And I think, you know, we come with this place, how we are placed, all of these, the importance of place is just absolutely well spotted in this particularly incredible book, Debra. I mean, these stories and episodes that you write of, they're not relegated to history. They're lived reality for our mob, for our families' lives. And thank you for sharing those truths. A good friend said to me only just yesterday, truth-telling is not a metaphor, it is a call for action. How do you hope these stories call your readers to respond?
I'd just really like for people to understand that this did not happen several hundred years ago, that this has happened within my life. The last massacre that impacted my mob was in 1924. That's, well, you know, it'll be 100 years next year. But so I was 40 and there were still people who were talking. I don't know why I said I was 40. There's something around the maths in there.
Wow.
But, you know, there were people who experienced that.
Yeah.
It's not something, you know, a long time ago. No. It's more recent than the First World War. And my children, you know, my husband is a non-Aboriginal man. His grandfather was one of the Anzacs, the original Anzacs. So my children get to acknowledge that and celebrate that because it should be. But they don't get the same privilege on the other side of the family, and it's more recent. It's way more recent, and it's way more local.
Yes.
It is so local. Where is any sense of justice or reality or truth in that? And I get how painful it is. I get how painful it is in a very real way because this is the history that my mob have survived and lived with. And we don't, as a nation, acknowledge terribly well how much we all benefit. And maybe that's the problem.
And that's the problem.
Maybe that's the problem. It's hard to articulate how much we benefit from displacement and massacre and genocide.
And erasure of all of the things that you've talked about, of the work, of the economic conditions that built this country.
Yep.
You've spent your life, Debra, saving stories for future generations, and it's key to highlight this again and again. As you say on page 52, I come from a culture that has never existed in the story of individuals. These stories have a job to do. They have knowledge to share. And one of the stories that I love in particular conveys a lot of protocols and practices about collecting the mamajama. We talked about this already. The berries. There's such movement in this story. I see you sharing a greeting with country and then racing after these turkeys. You're acknowledging ancestors. And as you tell the story, we fall through time with you. At the same time, we're very grounded in the place as you really describe what season it is and the smells and when you and your grandmother were spending time together, about your kids, about Rick. I mean, there's so much movement and relationality and place. And it really speaks to the non-linearity of First Nations storytelling. And I wonder if you can describe a little bit more about that approach to First Nations narrative practices for the audience.
I think so. The way that, for Gurangiwakai mob, our ways of relating, and I'm going to say it, I reckon it's absolutely the same and it's common right across Australia for all mob. We come from and we have these really strict, very formal ways of relating. You might have heard people talking about skin groups and kinship groups. There are so many rules bound within there. So my name is Prinjalanga. I am from the Rumbaria clan. I am part of the Murrumbarna songline. My skin group is Nimarama. So all of that points me absolutely to what my obligations are. And, there's this really lovely sense of almost casualness around Aboriginal culture and around Aboriginal relationships and family systems and structures. It ain't like that. It is not like that at all. My son, when he was about so high, playing soccer with relatives, and they were calling each other brother. And 3 of the grannies were sitting on the sideline watching this soccer game. And they all stood up. They walked on the pitch. And all of those young fellows all got a dressing down. You do not call him brother. He is not your brother. Don't you start doing that. You be respectful. So we are always pulled into line very quickly. So all of those laws and rules, they are the things that govern how we recount and what we recount. Because, I have sat with my grandmothers and someone has come and said, did you hear about such and such? And I know that they know about such and such and they know this much. And they all sit there and they go, no. Because that's what the skin group law tells them. That's what is governing what they do and how they do it. So this idea of the storying, the non-linear, the multiple voices, the non-human kin, all of that stuff is all governed. stories in here that I've recounted will have a very different sound and feel and even vocabulary if they were told by one of my children, for example. So, yes, when we are in town and, people introduce themselves to my children, particularly when they were young, and, they'll say, "Oh, I'm Auntie Debra." My children are horrified and they genuinely don't know what to do because by calling Auntie Debra Auntie, they are disrespecting Mob at home. So, I watch my kids kind of tiptoe around in really strange ways because it wouldn't occur to them to be or disrespectful here. But at the same time, they know that Granny's going to know about it and they're going to have to face up to that. So, yeah.
Accountability.
Every day. Every day.
Every day.
Every
it's
night.
An honour to be accountable, I say. I'm noticing we're coming up to 7:00, so I thought it would be great for us to open up to audience for some questions, and if there would be any questions in the audience. Sure. Hi.
Thank you. Thanks, Ree.
If you could state your name and then your question, please.
Sure. Sally Denshire.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your book. I've just freshly read it, and it's just very affecting and inspiring. I understand your daughter designed the cover without eye rolling, and I'm interested in the cover. Am I right that that's the drover's boy on the cover, or
no? This is my dad. Good question, Sally. Thank you. And I should have. So my daughter Raya, who won the NAIDOC Poster of the Year last year, designed the cover, and this is my dad. The drover's boy is his mum. So the non-Aboriginal drovers would, in some cases, kidnap Aboriginal women. And they were made to dress as men. Their hair was cut and their gender was hidden. And I had the most horrific experience a couple of years ago, more than a couple of years ago because, I'm 60, right? But I had a student at a university that I was teaching at, and we were talking about roles of Aboriginal people in the pastoral industry. And this student wrote an essay and said, the drover's boy, her job was to work with the cattle during the day and then to keep the men happy at night. And it was the most horrific kind of minimalisation of what those women did. And, all of those sorts of things have contributed to, I suppose, my need, in this. But, this is a little bit of a map of my country, and she's put in enough information for good Angie Mob to know where's what. But that's my dad. Thanks,
Thank
Sally.
you. Mitch.
Mitch Hibbins from Wiradjuri, so welcome to our place.
Thank you.
Mitch Hibbins, Wiradjuri, and welcome to be on our country. My question to you, Debra, is about the notion of responsibility, because the stories in this book are light and shade, they're profound, there's joy, there's hope, but there's also a deep amount of pain. You could have made a choice, because for us as Aboriginal people, we have these stories, to keep those stories within your family, within your community. Yeah. But you've chosen to share, and the responsibility to share. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that responsibility and the weight of that, particularly sharing it with an audience that may not fully ever grasp just how immense these stories are?
Thank you, Mitch. So my mum and I lived with a lot of domestic violence. My dad was not the result of the rape that time. And they have always, my mum and dad both have always said, write down the stories. And I said, well, what am I going to do with the stories? And my dad, and excuse my English, he said, just beat the bastards. I thought, oh, okay. I didn't quite know what he meant, but I did, and so they have always had this expectation of me writing our stories for us. And so this opportunity, I think as a teacher, I've always been really, really conscious of the deficit processing around Aboriginal students within learning contexts. And I have always struggled to understand where that notion comes from, because I do not see Aboriginal students in any way, shape or form being deficit. I see a lot of non-Aboriginal teachers who have not had the right training and the right sorts of in-service around pedagogical process, if you like. But the responsibility to around the sharing of these stories is something that I suppose, because I don't have a sense of it being my story, I cringe every time someone says it's a memoir. My responsibility is very much part of a group responsibility. And because you will know, within our mob, we have those responsibilities, but we also have the obligations. And so I come from an amazing family. There are very few of us left, but I have an amazing family who say, yeah, that's all right, bub, and that's it. There's nothing more. And it's like Maya Angelou's quote, picking it up and putting it down. We don't pick it up because we don't own it. It's all of us together. So, yeah,
Beautiful.
if that makes sense. Thanks, Mitch.
It's a great question. And another question? I have also one more question, but I will let you all have a chance. Yo.
I read it.
Oh. There's a question up here, and we'll take that on notice. Thank you.
Hi, Melissa here.
Your name?
Melissa,
Thank you, Melissa.
the arrangement of the stories, was that how you wrote it originally?
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yes. And that's, that's a good question, Melissa, thank you. What I was saying earlier about I'd started writing something else. I was fortunate enough to get a scholarship from Deakin, so I went home and I did the thing that I thought a research student should do. I got up every morning religiously, Antonia, and I typed. I diarised, and I read it, and it was so boring, and it was awful, and I still have it. And I read it every now and then, and I think, what was I thinking? And when I sort of thought and saw how dry it was, this supervisor was saying, how are you doing with the writing? And I lied. Yeah, it's great. And so I just thought, right, she's going to get really serious soon because she's that amazing. So yeah, that's the order. And as I said, I had this long document, and I thought, yeah, I don't know what's going to happen with chapters, because chapters was just not going to work. And so again, the wisdom and the experience of PhD supervision. Don't go with the chapters, Deb. So, there was a particular kind of freedom in that, because as Aboriginal people, we are kind of often educated into believing that this is the right way. And so the freedom of having somebody in your corner saying, you do this the way that it's going to work for you, was one of the most liberating things. So
incredible. Well, let me say thank you so very much, Debra Dank, for your book, We Come With This Place, and thank you, Racheal, for your performance of My Calling. Can we please put our hands together for Debra and Racheal?
thank you.